Hello and welcome to Enzo's Theater of the World. I'm your host, Enzo Cunanan.
And I'm Ethan.
And today we're going to be talking about Catherine Parr. So, Catherine Parr is the last wife of Henry VIII, and she's often described as the survivor. But in fact, she only survived Henry VIII by a year, and she's also often described as this sort of nursemaid figure who nursed for Henry in his last years. And again, that's not entirely true, as we're going to find out. She's a much more interesting figure than that, and she was more passionate and far more intelligent than this stereotype makes her out to be. So, Catherine Parr was born sometime in 1512 to Sir Thomas Parr, who was an esquire of the body and the master of the wards, so he was in charge of sort of arrangements for orphaned noble children and their marriages and stuff, and his wife, Maud Green, who is a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon. In fact, Catherine was probably named after Catherine of Aragon, and it's likely that Catherine of Aragon even served as her godmother, meaning that Henry VIII, when he would marry Catherine Parr, would be marrying his own first wife's goddaughter, which, don't think about that too hard, that's just kind of weird to think about. He was reigning for such a long time. Catherine was the eldest of 3 children. She had a brother named William and a sister named Anne, who would later marry a guy named William Herbert and would actually serve all 6 wives. William had an unhappy marriage of his own, but we don't have time to go into that. So, Catherine was well educated. Some people think she was as well educated as Anne Boleyn, although being an Anne Boleyn fan, I do have my doubts on this. She learned French, some Latin. She was skilled in needlework, although there is a story that when her mom wanted her to do her needlework, she was like, "My hands are ordained to touch scepters and crowns, not distaffs and needles." Which
I doubt the validity of that story.
Yeah, no, it sounds BS, and it sounds like it was made up after the fact, but it's a nice story, isn't it? No, it just makes her sound priggish and annoying. Okay. Yeah. So, unfortunately, when Catherine was only 5 years old, her father, Thomas, died during an outbreak of the plague. This left his wife, Maud, a very rich and young widow. However, she would never remarry, probably because of the financial independence it brought her. At the age of just 11 years old, Catherine was going to be engaged to the son of Lord Scrope, spelled S-C-R-O-P-E, but pronounced Scrope due to English pronunciation. However, this engagement was broken off because Catherine's mother did not have the money to both arrange for this marriage and for a good marriage to her son, William, who was married to Anne, the daughter of the Earl of Essex. Unfortunately, all of her plans would go awry when William Parr's wife, Anne, the daughter of the Earl of Essex, as I've just mentioned, would later cheat on him, have a kid with some random priest, and then run off to live with him, and, and be subsequently divorced from him by an act of Parliament. But fortunately for everyone, Maud was long dead before any of this came to fruition, because in 1531, Maud died. Now, Catherine probably wasn't there for the funeral, because 2 years earlier she had married a sickly young man named Edward Burr, and who used to be confused with his grandfather, also named Edward, and so it was like, oh, Catherine married an old man at the age of 17. No, that's not true. She married a sick young man at the age of 17, which is a bit better, but not really.
She probably didn't have to sleep with him all that much.
4 years later, unfortunately, Edward Burr died, leaving Catherine a widow at the ripe old age of 21. Not quite rich.
That's a shame.
So a year later, she got remarried again to a 40-year-old middle-aged man named John Neville, who was the 3rd Baron Latimer, thus becoming Lady Latimer. Catherine became a stepmother to John's 2 young children, a son, also named John, who was kind of a waste of space, and his daughter Margaret, who would tragically die at the age of 20. Unfortunately, this marital happiness did not last for long, because in 1536, during the reign of Henry VIII's 3rd wife, Jane Seymour, the Pilgrimage of Grace happened, and so they were protesting against the closure of the monasteries, and it was a big armed uprising of 30,000 people, and they forced Catherine's husband to to join their movement, and he was taken away, leaving Catherine alone with her stepchildren and all the servants in the house. However, in December, he managed to free himself and rushed quickly towards London to explain that that despite what it looked like, and despite how actively he had been supporting the rebel movement once he got in there, he was totally just being coerced by them, and it wasn't his fault, and please don't execute me. Unfortunately, once the rebels heard about this, in January the next year, Catherine and her stepchildren were held hostage at Snape Castle to force Lord Latimer to return. Lord Latimer returned and managed to persuade the rebels to calm down and leave the children and his wife alone, but this must have been a harrowing experience for the young Catherine. Catherine, of course, as we know from the Jane Seymour episode, the Pilgrimage of Grace was crushed, and Lord Latimer was interviewed heavily by the council, but thanks to some powerful, influential people, including Catherine's brother William and her uncle, also named William, Lord Latimer was freed. Fast forward a few years. So at this point, it is 1543, and so the pattern of wives has gone divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded. Catherine is at court, and she has met this dude named Thomas Seymour. He's a very roguish, handsome, dark, sexually aggressive sort of man, and she falls in love with him. Now, unfortunately,
it's just like how it's normally described. There are like historical basis for it.
There is historical basis for the sexually aggressive part because literally take a look at what he did to his stepdaughter at the end of the episode. But we're going to
we mean like predator, not like daring.
Both. The predator part wasn't on full display yet, and so.
Also, what does it mean? Like, it's so weird to me when they describe someone as dark, but not in like skin tones. Just like, but not dark isn't evil either. Just no.
He's like
brooding.
Yeah. So like he was a very cultured man, but unfortunately, Catherine was already married. Fortunately for Catherine, or unfortunately, I guess, depending on who you were, Catherine's husband, Lord Latimer, had never really recovered from the excitement of the Pilgrimage of Grace, and he was slowly dying of some sort of undefinable illness. So, Catherine looked like she was going to be marrying Thomas Seymour after her husband died, and he would be her third husband, and she would fade into the annals of history. However, in February 1543, Henry VIII made a gift of sleeves to Catherine. This is interesting, and no one is quite sure how he noticed her. Some people thought that she served in Mary's household as a lady-in-waiting, but this seems rather unlikely considering her husband was literally dying, so and there's no evidence for it. Anyway, some people think that, I think they're wrong. Anyway, so, and I'm the host of this podcast, so I can make what I along with you, so I get to tell the story. So, sometime in March 1543, the next month, Lord Latimer finally died, and so Catherine was still thinking of pursuing Thomas Seymour, but as the gift had shown, she had caught Henry VIII's eye. Catherine, however, for what it is worth, did not want to marry the king, and even
That's reasonable. She's already rich.
Yeah, even if he had already proposed to her sometime in the early summer. As she wrote to Thomas Seymour later on, I would not have you think that this mine honest goodwill towards you to proceed from any sudden motion of passion. For as truly as God is God, my mind was fully bent the other time I was at liberty, aka before she married Henry, to marry you before any man I know. Howbeit, God withstood my will therein most vehemently for a time. She then talks in that letter about how she prayed over it a lot, and she got to thinking, and eventually she decided that it was God's will to marry Henry. Not only for power and stuff, but in fact that was one of the least of her concerns. No, it was for a religious mission, so that she could help convert Henry and the whole of England to the truth of the gospel. Because you see, sometime before the year 1544, Catherine, which was a year into her marriage, so at least we know by a year into her marriage she was a Protestant, but like probably around this time she was probably already a Protestant. And, like, a full-blown Protestant. Henry was not a Protestant. He was a Catholic who didn't believe in purgatory or the Pope or monasteries. And or the seven sacraments partially. He was kind of a complicated figure, but he did think of himself essentially as a Catholic. And so he would not be happy with Catherine if he knew this. But on the outside, Catherine was, still the weird, idiosyncratic blend of Catholicism and Protestantism that Henry, mandated for everyone in his kingdom.
So it was literally just like an I can fix him story.
Yeah, it's not...
Also, to our viewers, if you don't mind, we're going to turn on the lights in our room where we're recording.
Yeah, so things were not looking good for the reformists at this time, as not only had Henry passed a very Catholic act called what was it? The 10 9 it was in 1539. It was a set of articles. The name escapes me off the top of my head, but because it's not that important. But yeah, no, it escapes me. But Henry had been passing increasingly conservative legislation religiously, such as the Act for the True Advancement of True Religion, which restricted Bible reading to clerics, noblemen, and the gentry. But gentry and noblewomen, in particular, were only allowed to read it in private. Poor people were banned from reading the Bible in English altogether because it was thought they were too stupid for such things. So, finally, after a few months of deliberation, Catherine accepted Henry's proposal, and on July 12, 1543, in Hampton Court, in the Queen's Closet, Catherine married Henry in front of a small group of 20 people, including Mary, Elizabeth, the Bishop of Winchester, Stephen Gardiner, who was conducting the marriage, and Catherine's sister.
Did they just have, like, a different definition of closet back then?
It was, like, it just meant a private space, I think. I don't think it meant a, like, literal closet.
Boy, a lot of space in here for clothes.
If I did see a picture of it, it's not that big, but 20 people could still feasibly fit in it without violating a fire code. So, anyway. So, Catherine took as her motto, to be useful in all I do, which was nice. It seemed like she was trying to model herself again after the best qualities of the first three wives. She was, contrary to the popular image of her as this sort of blue stocking who was sort of middle-aged and didn't care about fashion or whatever. She did care about fashion. She bought 47 pairs of shoes in 1 year. She loved the color crimson. She patronized painters like Lucas Hornbolt and Lovina Teerlinck. She hired Italians to play recorders and violins for her. And she had this fashion sense of Anne Boleyn. With Jane Seymour, with Catherine of Aragon, she was adopting from Catherine of Aragon this sort of motif of being useful to Henry as a wife. And also borrowing from the Jane Seymour sort of knowing when to be quiet and not go into headlong into arguments like Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn. People at the time when she married Henry had nothing but glowing praise for her. Her chaplain, Francis Goldsmith, said that her rare goodness has made every day a Sunday, and Chancellor Thomas Risley wrote, "She is a woman, in my judgment, for certain wisdom and gentleness most meet for his highness, and I am sure his majesty never had wife more agreeable to his heart." So, this wouldn't last long, obviously. People would soon catch on, if not Henry, to the fact that Catherine was a bit more Protestant than Henry would have liked from everyone, and soon the conservatives at court would become her enemies. But for right now, things seem good. So, Catherine, at this time, started to bring the royal family back together. She convinced Henry to give... She probably convinced Henry to give his assent to the third act of succession, which reinstated Mary and Elizabeth into the line of succession, but which did not legitimate them. It still claimed they were bastards, but they were put back in the line of succession after Edward, if he had no kids. Catherine also took charge of Elizabeth and Edward's education, and made sure they had Protestant teachers and tutors like John Cheek and Roger Ascham. In fact, by 1544, Catherine felt confident enough to publish a book, although it was anonymous. It was called Psalms or Prayers, and it was a translation of some work done by John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester, who had been beheaded by Henry for not recognizing him as head of the church. So there is a reason it was anonymous, because, Catherine, at this point, it's worth talking a bit about her intellectual abilities. Catherine published 2 books when she was queen, one under her own name, one anonymously, and she, as has been said, knew French, Latin to some degree, although she did work on it. She, in fact, engaged in this adorable correspondence with the 7-year-old Edward over Latin, and he was like, "You're doing very good studying Latin," and I'm like, "Oh, that's so heartwarming for a 7-year-old to be telling a 30-something-year-old woman that she's doing good at Latin," but it shows Edward's confidence. She also undertook the study of Italian and Spanish, meaning that she probably actually spoke more languages than Anne Boleyn, although, Anne had
neither here nor there.
Anne had a lot on her plate, is all I'm going to say as an Anne defender.
She was also much cooler.
In January 1544, Henry had finally fell out with Francis I of France again, and so he decided that along with Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, he would invade France. And not only that, he would lead the army personally, despite being very fat and ulcerated and short of breath all the time at this point.
Yeah.
People were shocked.
We're late game Henry. He's not useful at all.
Yeah, so in February 1544, the Duke of Najera, who was a Spanish envoy, came to court to sort of finalize this agreement. And he has a very interesting description of Catherine. He wrote that she was dressed in a robe of cloth of gold and a petticoat of brocade with sleeves lined with crimson satin and trimmed with 3 piled crimson velvet. Her train was more than 2 yards long. Suspended from her neck were 2 crosses and a jewel of very rich diamonds, and in her head were very many and beautiful ones. Her girdle was gold with very large pendants. She has a lively and pleasing appearance and is praised as a virtuous woman. Now, like Catherine Howard before her, Catherine Parr had auburn hair and gray eyes. However, Catherine Parr does seem to have, it's possible she was a bit taller. Her coffin measured 5'10", although it's unlikely she was, all that.
Yeah,
Otherwise, someone would have commented on it. But it's interesting to think she could have been the tallest of the wives. She from the portraits, it seems like she had a kind of a squarer face than Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, who both had kind of pointy faces. That's just something I noticed. Oh, and just as a side note, because I'm looking here right now, Catherine did keep parrots and a dog named Rig, who is a pet spaniel with a gold and crimson collar. That's just nice, isn't it? Anyway.
She has kind of a theme going on, I think.
A
lot of crimson, gold, velvet, things like that.
And yeah, it's worth noting that that fashion was a way that Catherine could sort of fashion her
younger than she was.
She was like 31 when Henry married her.
Yeah, no, and she also pumped out a bunch of kids too.
No, she didn't.
Oh, she didn't? Yeah, they were stepchildren.
Yeah, no, she hadn't been married before Henry leaves for France. I feel like it's worth pointing out in this point in the narrative. What did Henry see in Catherine Parr? She was a widow twice before. She wasn't that rich of a widow, and even if she was rich, Henry didn't need the money. And also, she hadn't had any kids during her 2 marriages, so even though Henry did actually want kids with Catherine, and it's likely he did consummate the marriage with her, it's kind of unclear at first glance why he would want her. However, I think there's 2 reasons. First of all, Catherine was a very cultured woman, and she loved music and art, and so did Henry, and so that was something they could bond over. And she had had a good And secondly, she had had a good education, unlike Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, and Catherine Howard, so she could fully appeal to Henry's intellectual and cultured side, just like Anne Boleyn did. And just like Anne Boleyn, Catherine was of the reformist persuasion, although she kept her true depths hidden. Nevertheless, this meant that she could debate and discuss with Henry, even if he was sometimes more irascible than he was during the Anne Boleyn years. And in fact, it's likely she was the first wife who could engage with him on an intellectually equal basis since Anne Boleyn, because Jane Seymour was too quiet, Anne of Cleves wasn't one for religion, really.
And didn't speak English all that well. So
and Catherine Howard was a literal teenager. So, and also, she does seem to have been a lively person underneath all her religious fervor, as we'll get into later. But, so yeah, culture, intelligence, and a sort of liveliness that can't be captured in the portraits, I think. That's what I think drew Henry to Catherine Parr.
There's also another big thing, which is, again, this is a common theme with Henry. If you want to know what his next wife will be like, look at who he just got rid of.
Yeah, he got rid of Catherine Howard, who was a teenager.
Catherine Howard,
who was young.
Teenager, maybe a little too young. And cheated. It's kind of like
a bit silly.
Keep up.
Catherine Parr is a solid widow who
he knows the
praised for her virtue.
He knows that she's not a virgin, and it's fine. Like.
This is the only acceptable way to not be a virgin at this point.
She's a widow. Henry wants someone now who he knows what to expect from. Mm-hmm. He's had enough of wild, wacky women.
And it's clear, actually, I think, that Catherine had this sort of some sort of quiet, good sense which endeared her to most people around her. Because in July 1544, just a year after they were married, Henry announced that Catherine would be regent of England during his absence, which had only happened once before with her namesake, Catherine of Aragon. Queen Catherine had a this Catherine Parr, had a group of advisors, including the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, Lord Chancellor Thomas Risley, the Earl of Hertford, who was Edward Seymour, Prince Edward's uncle, etc. And later that month, Henry and an army of 40,000 men, which is one of the largest ever mustered in the Tudor era, crossed the Channel to Calais. Catherine wrote a letter to Henry during this time, which I think, as he was making war in France, which I think speaks to her sort of personality. It's full of, it's endearing and sort of affectionate, but not, passionate. This is very much sort of a woman who can keep a handle on her emotions to an appropriate degree as thought of at the time. She wrote, "Although the discourse of time and account of days neither is long nor many, of your majesty's absence, yet the want of your presence, so much beloved and desired of me, maketh me that I cannot quietly pleasure in anything, until I hear from your majesty. The time, therefore, to me, seemeth very long, with a great desire to know how your highness hath done since your departing hence, ... God, the knower of secrets, can judge these words not only to be written with ink, but most truly impressed in the heart." So, Catherine actually did oversee a lot of things, even though, as regent, even though she wasn't involved with fighting off a literal invasion like Catherine of Aragon. She instead oversaw the rough wooing, which was an attempt by the English to sort of bully the Scottish into making their one-year-old Queen Mary, Queen of Scots, marry Prince Edward, and some organization for the French War. She even wrote a prayer of thanksgiving and sort of hope for Henry's victory in France, to stir the courage of the court. Henry, in 1544, in September, at the end of September, finally arrived home in England, triumphant, quote-unquote, having taken the single town of Boleyn from the French. And that was it, because he didn't feel like going on to Paris, because he was old and fat and couldn't do that.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, Catherine welcomed him as a hero.
And likely agreed with him. Like, yes, honey, you did take Boleyn. Who's my great king who took Boleyn? Very great. And as you'll see later, this would only serve to harm Henry, as now that you have the town, you actually have to, maintain it, which is an extra expense.
It's likely that as Catherine welcomed her husband back to England, she relinquished her power as regent and thus became a queen's consort again with all the vulnerabilities of one. It's likely that her brief time as regent had a strong influence on the young Elizabeth with regard to female rule. Perhaps it was here that Elizabeth learned that women could rule just as well as men. Catherine, in December, at Christmas that year in 1544, was presented by her stepdaughter Elizabeth, who, keep in mind, was only 11, with a 100-page-ish translation of the French book The Mirror of the Sinful Soul, written by Marguerite de Navarre,
and translated by Elizabeth herself.
Yes, and handwritten translation, and she also embroidered the cover and bound the book herself.
That's one of those gifts where it's very clear they're doing it less for your enjoyment and more to show off.
And then she was like, please excuse me for my rude translation, and I'm like, be quiet!
Come on, really? The gift is just, hey, look at my academic project. Woo!
I'm sure Catherine was delighted.
I mean, on one hand, yes, it's very cool and very impressive, but the fact you hand-translated it comes off as a bit showboaty.
Yeah. So Catherine, the next year, in March 1545, a bunch of people died. I'm not going to say who, because it's unimportant, but the end result was that Catherine got to sort of stock her household and full of reformist officials and ladies, including her uncle William Parr of Horton, her first cousin Lady Lane, and the Tyrwhitt couple, who would later they would be involved with stuff with the young Elizabeth when she became a teenager, and maybe if we get to covering the Seymour scandal in more detail than we will at the end of this episode, perhaps in the second season of this podcast, we will revisit the Tyrwhitts, because they're an interesting bunch. But anyway, so in June 1545, with Henry's full approval, Catherine published a book under her name, which, under her name, Queen Catherine, and it was called Prayers or Meditations, and it was the first book published in England by a woman under her own name. This was big. Unfortunately, it is just a series of prayers and meditations, as the title says, so I'm not going to actually be reading it out. But Catherine also at this time spent her time doing other intellectual activities. She was offered by the Universities of Cambridge and Oxford to become their patrons, which she gladly accepted. She worked with Sir Nicholas Udall, who had a rather unsavory reputation of not only child abuse and physically, but also sex. Anyway, regardless to say, I'm not sure she knew of that, and she worked with him and her stepdaughter Mary to translate Erasmus's paraphrases of the Gospels. And at this time, she began work on a book called Lamentations of a Sinner. It had some orthodox ideas. For instance, she wrote about how our Moses and most godly wise governor and king hath delivered us out of the captivity and bondage of Pharaoh. I mean by this Moses King Henry the VIII, my most sovereign, favorable lord and husband. And I mean by this Pharaoh the Bishop of Rome, who hath been and is a greater persecutor of all the true Christians than ever was Pharaoh of the children of Israel. For blah 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 blah.
Now that's a bold claim.
The regenerated by Christ are never offended at the works of God, because they know by faith that God doeth all things well, blah 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 blah. But here is the thing. That part would have been all fine and well to Henry. What would have not been fine are all the Protestant bits throughout it, because she made very clear she believed in salvation by faith alone in this book, not by, good works and
deeds?
Stuff.
Very not.
Very much on good deeds
cringe.
And faith. She was like faith alone. She goes on here and on, and you can tell she's like a full-blown Protestant of the of the sort that would be recognizable today, but she didn't publish it until Henry was dead, because there's no way. But so I think it's interesting. It's a bit, some people think that it's a bit much, and I agree. She talks about how she used to love the darkness, and about superstitious weaklings, and how evilly the word of God is spoken, and she goes on, and frankly it's a bit much for me.
She just does a lot of things she doesn't like about current Christianity.
Yeah, so although Henry may not have known, the Catholics at court sure did take notice, and headed by Stephen Gardiner, the Bishop of Winchester, and Thomas Risley and Richard Rich, they plotted the downfall of Henry's sixth wife. She was actually they used as evidence, as they were gathering evidence, they used as proof of her heresy, the fact that she was surrounded by noted reformists like the Seymours, and Edward Seymour, Lord Hertford's wife, Anne Seymour, the Duchess of Suffolk, Catherine Willoughby, all these sorts of people. And in May 1546, not in May, a bit before this, in February 1546, there were rumors in Antwerp and other foreign places that Henry was looking for a new wife. And this must have been alarming to Catherine, because either this was put out by the king himself, or this was put out by people close to the king, and either way, this should have been a warning sign to her that she should really turn back from her religious views and keep them more quiet, because she kept on, all this time she had been speaking with Henry and sort of discussing and debating religion with him, and so Henry was growing a bit irascible as the year grew on, and so now we bring in another actor into the story, a woman named Anne Askew. So in May 1546, she was arrested for preaching Protestant heresy and whatnot. And Anne Askew was a very interesting woman. She had been married to an abusive husband, but ran off to London to try and get a divorce from him, which was considered unheard of because she was a woman. But she kept on preaching and talking about Protestantism, and she may or may not have been linked to ladies in the Queen's household. However, in June that year, she was sent to the Tower of London, where after being indicted for heresy, she was tortured, and she was actually tortured by Chancellor Thomas Risley himself and Richard Rich, both of them personally turning the levers of the rack on which she was put. As Anne Askew wrote, presumably, but she dictated it to someone Then they did put me on the rack, because I confessed no ladies or gentlewomen to be of my belief, and thereon they kept me a long time. And because I lay still and did not cry out, my Lord Chancellor and Master Rich took pains to rack me with their own hands till I was nigh dead. Then the lieutenant caused me to be loosed from the rack. Incontinently I swooned, and then they recovered me again. After that, I sat 2 long hours reasoning with my Lord Chancellor upon the bare floor. She went through a lot, and in fact, the lieutenant of the tower, Anthony Knivet, was so horrified by this that he just left by them torturing a woman, which was illegal, that he went straight to the king and was like, "Well, I can't believe this is happening." And the king was like, just she's a Protestant, just let that slide.
You don't get it. Protestants aren't actual women.
Yeah. So, and now comes the greatest drama of Catherine's life, because it is here that Catherine nearly became the third marital victim, Henry's third marital victim, the third wife to die, whatever. She nearly.
Right here was where the rhyme almost wouldn't have worked, because it wouldn't have.
It would have become 7 people, and that wouldn't have been nice for school children. So it was sometime between March and August, and so I'm just going to summarize from the account we have here, which is from Fox's Book of Martyrs. Was it his Book of Martyrs? Yeah, it was his Book of Martyrs. So Catherine and Henry were discussing religion one day, but Henry had been growing tired of his wife sort of discussing and debating religion with him, especially since it sounded like, dangerously at times, like she had her own opinion, which couldn't be changed by Henry. And so when
Henry didn't like that. He just liked you to be like a mirror to bounce off his ideas. Mm-hmm. Much like a...
He loved intelligent women, but he loved intelligent women, but in the end he did want them to submit to his opinion ultimately, along with everyone else. He didn't like other people having determined opinions. And so one night, after he had dismissed Catherine after their debate, he grumbled, "A good hearing it is, when women become such clerks, and a thing much to my comfort, to come in mine old days to be taught by my wife." And Bishop Stephen Gardiner of Winchester was just standing there, and he was like, "Oh, your majesty, won't you hear about how wrong it is for any of your subjects to reason and argue with you so pertly, and how grievous it is for everyone to hear this, because they're your subjects. And in addition, this doctrine that the Queen maintains is dangerous to the policy of princes, and it teaches the people that all things should be in common. And I would like to investigate if this heresy is confined to the Queen, or if it is amidst her household." And that's a paraphrase of the account. And so Henry was
surrounded by the most annoying people.
And so Henry was like, "Oh, sure, I give you permission." And so they planned to accuse her sister, her first cousin, her sister, Lady Herbert, her first cousin, Lady Lane, Lady Tyrwhitt, and other ladies, along with the Queen herself, and they would all be sent to the Tower, and then the reformist faction would fall, and then the conservative Catholics would triumph. However, Henry was talking with one of his physicians, and he let him know, "Oh, I'm going to have something done about Catherine. She bugs me too much with all her independent thinking. and
arguing
and the Bill of Articles, and so somehow, one way or another, the Bill of Articles drawn against the Queen and writ and signed by the King fell out of the pocket of one of the counselors. Somehow, maybe it was on purpose, maybe Henry was doing this as a warning shot, maybe it wasn't on purpose, and Catherine just genuinely got lucky. But whatever the reason, that sort of bill drawn up against the Queen fell in the corridor, and one of her ladies found it, and Catherine became, quote-unquote, fell incontinently into a great melancholy and agony, bewailing and taking on in such sort as was lamentable to see.
I would too if I knew I might be beheaded.
She kept screaming and crying in this vein up until Henry got fed up and wanted to know what was going on, so he sent his doctors to her.
Women so emotional about maybe being killed. Am I right, fellas?
Yeah, so he sent one of his doctors to her, and the doctor was like, "Hey, listen, look, I'm a Protestant too, and I know we both believe in this, but Henry doesn't like Protestantism, so please just, quote-unquote, frame and conform yourself unto the King's mind, and, quote-unquote, use all secrecy in that behalf." So basically, just lie and tell him you didn't actually mean what you meant. Don't martyr yourself. We've had enough bloodshed for this time. So the next night, Catherine, with a few of her ladies, went into the king's bedchamber, and Henry was talking and sitting and talking to some people, and he started talking about religion, and this was sort of a test for Catherine. Would she take the bait? And Catherine sort of mildly responded, and she said, "Your Majesty doth right well know neither I myself am ignorant what great imperfection and weakness by our first creation is allotted unto us women, to be ordained and appointed and subject unto man as our head, from which head all our direction ought to proceed, and that as God made man to his own shape and likeness, even so also he made man of woman, of whom and by whom she is to be governed, commanded, and directed, whose womanly weaknesses and natural imperfection ought to be tolerated, aided, and borne withal, so that by his wisdom such things lacking in her ought to be supplied." And then she was like, "Oh, I'm a silly poor woman. Your Majesty is excellent in gifts of and ornaments of wisdom. Yet must I, and will I, refer my judgment in this and on all other cases to your Majesty's wisdom, as my only anchor, supreme head, and governor here on earth, next to God to lean unto." And then Henry said, "Not so, by St. Mary, you are become a doctor, Kate, to instruct us as we take it, and not to be instructed or directed by us." And then Catherine said, "If your Majesty take it so, then your Majesty hath very much mistaken me, who hath ever been of the opinion to think it unseemly and preposterous for a woman to take upon her the office of an instructor or teacher unto her lord and husband, but rather to learn of her husband and to be taught by him. And whereas I have, with your Majesty's leave, heretofore been bold to hold talk with your Majesty, wherein sometimes I have had different opinions, I have not done it so much to maintain opinion, as it did to minister talk, not only to the end your Majesty might with less grief pass over this painful time of your infirmity," meaning his leg ulcer, "but also that I, hearing your Majesty's learned discourse, might receive to myself some profit thereby, wherein I assure your Majesty I have not missed any part of my desire in that behalf, having always referring myself in all matters unto your Majesty, as by command of nature it is convenient for me to do."
No, I was not arguing with you. I was learning from you.
"I was merely trying to distract you from your leg ulcer, and also learn because I am a stupid woman." And Henry then said that's essentially what she said. And then Henry, I quoted it somewhat in full because I feel you need to hear how floridly and thickly she lays it on. Like, it's quite a lot.
She is quite the good orator, though.
I feel like she was saying this while trembling. And then Henry said, "And is it even so, sweetheart? And you intended your arguments to no worse end than perfect friends we are now again, as ever at any time heretofore." And then he wrote that it did him more good that it does me more good at this time to hear those words from your own mouth than if I heard news of 100,000 pounds falling in my lap. And he was very happy. But then the next day, because it was at night, and he hadn't actually told everyone to call for the arrest warrant, as Catherine was busy talking with Henry in the gardens, Chancellor Risley and a troop of guards came up marching to her with the arrest warrant for Queen Catherine. Catherine was petrified. What would Henry do? Was this a setup? But then Henry looked at the warrant, tore it in pieces, and then started hitting Risley with... not hitting Risley. He started shouting at him, calling him an arrant beast, knave, and fool.
"How dare you do
and
the
told
thing
him to,
that I wrote to you, telling you could do."
He then told him to, quote-unquote, "avaunt out of his presence," which, yeah...
is a weird way to talk to somebody about the thing that you told them was okay to do and did not tell them otherwise.
Catherine, magnanimous in victory, told Henry to please be kind towards these conspirators because they didn't know what they were doing. That's a paraphrase, mind you. And Henry was like, "Okay, sure."
God, she's so good at public image.
And so Catherine survived. Bishop Gardiner was thrown under the bus by his Catholic allies and promptly lost all favor, and the reformist faction grew even more powerful. This was in 1546, and there was some other stuff that happened that year, including a meeting with the French admiral where Henry maybe not jokingly, suggested that in England and France they would just get rid of Mass altogether and institute a simple communion service, and asked him what the King of France would think of that, to the kind of shock of everyone, since Henry had previously been very Catholic. No one knows what he was thinking. One historian has wrote that only God knows what God and Henry know what Henry was thinking at this time with his diplomacy.
You know, maybe he just was like, this
Maybe he was
leg
just
ulcer
trolling.
really hurts. I wish Mass was shorter so I could go back to being in my room instead of listening to this worthless pastor talk while my leg really hurts.
Henry's health was deteriorating. His leg ulcer was deteriorating, and so he by this point he had to be like wheeled up and down the stairs in a like pulley contraption, and he couldn't walk, and it was bad, and so it looked like he was going to die soon. And so in December 1546, the Reformists launched an attack on the Conservatives. The Duke of Norfolk's son, the Earl of Surrey, was accused of failing to observe Lent and putting the arms of Edward the Confessor on his coat of arms, which meant that he was a traitor somehow because he was plotting to steal the throne from Edward. And Henry was old and irascible and kind of paranoid at this point, so he believed that. And they threw him and the Duke of Norfolk into the Tower, which, you know...
As you do.
The Earl of Surrey would be beheaded just a few days before Henry's death. And the Duke of Norfolk, well, he would almost be executed. But something would save him. What that would be? I'll tell you. So, in December 1546... Henry left Catherine, Elizabeth, and Mary for the last time at Greenwich. He went instead to Whitehall, and he seems to have had a formal goodbye to Catherine, telling everyone to honor her after his death as if he was still alive, and to give her like £3,000, I think it was, as like stuff to sustain her, like as a pension, because of how good she had been towards him. Henry, in the last few days of his life, towards the end of January, had revealed a list of 24 councillors he wanted to form a regency council after his death for his 9-year-old son Edward, and top of the list was Edward Seymour, who would be Lord Protector. And so on January 27, Henry summoned his confessor and took Holy Communion. However, when asked if he had anything to say, he said, he said, "Yeah, I have something to say, but to Archbishop Cranmer, but I'll sleep a little first." And then he never woke up. He fell into a coma, and by the time Archbishop Cranmer was sort of hustled there into the bedroom to sort of ask Henry, "Do you die in the faith of Christ?" Henry could no longer speak, but he did manage to give a single powerful squeeze of his hand, showing Cranmer that he died in the faith of Christ. At 2 a.m. in the morning, on the 28th of January, 1547, Henry VIII died at the age of 55, and after a reign of 37 years.
Now, to be fair, I think it's sort of a good thing that he died before the... Because, like, his last words were so much more iconic than if he just said, then if you went on some kind of, like, long-winded speech or choking on all of his words.
Some Catholics later on would claim that he shouted, "Monks! Monks! Monks!" because he was seeing their ghosts in the corner of his eyes, but there was no evidence for this.
Why would he be scared of them? They're all, like, tiny nerds who are way shorter than him. And bald, too.
So what happened to the Duke of Norfolk? It turns out the Duke of Norfolk's execution day was scheduled for the 29th of January. But Henry had died, so they just kind of kept him in there until Mary's reign. So that was nice for him. His son still got
You can't have an execution if there's no king.
Well, no, Edward was king. It's just that it's not the nice note to start off on bloodshed, you know? And they never got around to doing it, so...
Coronation at 8, and then we'll have the execution at 12.
Edward Seymour wasted no time in declaring himself Lord Protector, as Henry may or may not have wanted, and in addition, sidelining all the rest of the council and declaring that he was really the regent for Edward, and everyone else should just bugger off and do what he said, which was definitely not what Henry wanted. Definitely not what Henry wanted also, was for Edward Seymour and all of the other people to take part in a weird gift-giving ceremony where they all bestowed titles upon themselves because they claimed it was what Henry wanted and only they had been told about it.
Now you know why Henry really wanted an heir.
Edward Seymour became Duke of Somerset, which, okay.
Yeah,
and he claimed Henry wanted it. Okay.
This is why you kind of want to have your son as soon as possible. Otherwise, this happens.
Something that Henry did want, however, was for Catherine to not be part of the Regency Council because he didn't believe women could rule. However, he had
It probably didn't help when she gave that whole "women are stupid" speech.
However, she had actually expected to be part of the Regency Council, and Henry hadn't told her otherwise, so she was kind of shocked to learn that her "women are stupid" speech had unintended side effects.
Though you told me that women should be the learners, you have taught me one thing. That women are stupid and should never hold power. Thank you for this one great lesson.
Wait, no, I didn't mean that.
Sometimes the student becomes the teacher.
In February 1547, Edward, at the age of 9, was crowned King Edward VI, and he would later go on to be memorialized in the famous Mark Twain novel, The Prince and the Pauper. But where is Catherine in all of this? Well, she left court and retired to one of her manors in Chelsea, and in the spring of 1547, after romantically suggesting to the council that he married the 13-year-old Princess Lady Elizabeth and being rejected, Thomas Seymour turned his eye towards his old love, Catherine Parr, and finally...
How old at this point?
She is...
30-something?
35, I think.
Right.
And so Catherine, when Thomas proposed to her, joyfully accepted, and in May 1547, just 3 months after Henry's death, they were married in secret. Because it was unseemly for a woman, especially a royal widow, to be married literally 3 months after Henry's death. It's a bit much. She seems to have forgotten all about her protestations of God and faith and jumped right ahead.
But to be fair, in the last a couple months of his life, he was basically just like...
He was threatening to execute her for all of it, basically. He had been hanging that threat, like...
Yeah, and he wasn't really doing much, just kind of sitting around and moaning.
And then dying.
My leg!
So she actually invited the Lady Elizabeth, who was 13, and the Lady Jane Grey, who was 10, to live in her household with her at Chelsea. And a few months later, Catherine's marriage to Thomas Seymour became known. However, Edward did not get as angry as everyone expected because Thomas had a habit of giving him pocket money because apparently his other brother Edward had been too stingy, and King Edward kept complaining, and so Thomas Seymour was like, "Here you go."
Imagine being the king and having to ask for an allowance.
He was 9, but still he is the king.
I would have just been older.
In November 1547, Catherine finally felt confident enough under the Protestant regime of Edward to publish her Lamentations of a Sinner. However, it was also during this year that Thomas Seymour began to turn his attention once again to the 13-year-old Elizabeth, 13-14-year-old. It took place over a number of months. So, early in the morning, I'm just going to quote from David Starkey here, who, although being cancelled for being a racist, misogynist, and somehow homophobic, despite being a gay man himself, asshole.
Wait, what? How?
Don't think on that. He's very much the sort of rich, he's the embodiment of that saying that rich white gay men are more identifying with the rich and white and male parts rather than the gay part. Anyway, so David Starkey writes, early in the morning, Thomas Seymour would come into Elizabeth's bedchamber, of which he had pocketed the key. If she were up, but not dressed, he bade her a hearty good morrow, and struck her upon the back or buttocks familiarly. If she were still in bed, he pulled back the curtains to make as though he would come at her. Elizabeth would then seek refuge by retreating to the furthest corner of the bed. On one occasion, when the household was staying in his own London house, he entered clad only in his nightshirt and gown, or as the contemporary account put it, bare-legged. Seymour did pretty well everything else other than go so far. He snatched kisses from Elizabeth, played with her maids, and stole embraces from her under his very wife's nose. I would not call them
embraces. I feel like that's a bit of a poor wording for what is statutory rape.
No, he didn't rape her. He just molested her.
Molestation.
Yeah. It's worth noting that Elizabeth's feelings seem to have been very conflicted about this. She seems to have been flattered by her new stepfather's attentions, especially because she had been a bit secluded before this, and so this was her first encounter with real romantic stuff. But on the other hand, she does seem to have been afraid, as one time she wrote in a prayer book, "Noli me tangere." Was it a prayer book or a letter? I don't remember, but she wrote somewhere, "Noli me tangere," when talking about Thomas Seymour, which translates in Latin to "do not touch me." So...
yeah, maybe not the best introduction to your first real father.
Astonishingly, at three times, according to the testimony of Elizabeth's servants later, Catherine herself participated in these games. Two mornings, for instance, Catherine joined her husband to tickle Elizabeth in bed, and later, as Elizabeth walked in the garden in a gown of black velvet, Catherine held her while Seymour cut her gown into 100 pieces. So that's kind of weird. What are we to make of Catherine's involvement in this? Well, by this time she had become pregnant, so it is possible that at the age of 36, which was very late for a first pregnancy at that point, that Catherine's hormones were just feeling very wacky, and she did think that Thomas was just being
a little goofy,
a little
funny,
prankster.
Not a pedophile.
After all, she wasn't there when he slapped her butt. She wasn't there when he went into her bedroom without any pants on. She wasn't there when he tried to kiss her and Elizabeth retreated behind the bed curtains. She wasn't there when Elizabeth decided to wake up early and put all her clothes on so that Thomas wouldn't see her dressed in only a nightgown. Which says something about all this, doesn't it?
Boy, that's something.
Indeed, it's likely that Thomas took the opportunity to gaslight Catherine herself, and he even told her once that he totally saw Elizabeth with her arms around this one dude, and she was kissing him, and when Catherine confronted Elizabeth, she was like, I haven't been with anyone but my tutor, and I'm not kissing him, and Catherine was like, that's fair. But where did that report come from then? My husband couldn't have lied. So, of course,
technically he wasn't lying.
So, yes, he was actually. So,
the dude is just him.
Yeah, yeah. So then, so at some point in 1548, perhaps in May, Catherine realized that things had gone too far. She caught Thomas Seymour, her husband, with his arms around Elizabeth in a weird sort of romantic embrace that was very inappropriate for a 40-something-year-old man and a 14-year-old girl.
And also a stepfather. Oops.
For Elizabeth's protection and to save her reputation, she arranged for her to go and live with Anthony Denny. Maybe after the birth of her child, she would be able to return to the household. And so, in June, the next month, Catherine and Thomas moved to Sudeley Castle, one of Thomas's estates, and on the 30th of August, 1548, Catherine gave birth to a healthy child. Unfortunately, it was a daughter, and unfortunately for Catherine, just a few days later, she became ill with puerperal fever and delirious. Lady Tyrwhitt, who I've mentioned earlier as being a Protestant who attended on Queen Catherine at court, gave testimony later on about some of Catherine's last words. In her delirium, she told Thomas that I am not well handled, for those that be about me care not for me, but stand laughing at my grief, and the more good I will to them, the less good they will to me. And then Thomas answered, Why, sweetheart, I would do you no hurt. And she said, No, my lord, I think so, but my lord, you have given me many shrewd taunts. She continued in this delirium for a few days, up until, in September 5, 1548, at the age of 36, Catherine Parr died at Sudeley Castle. Her daughter Mary would only live for 2 more years before dying sometime around 1550. I say sometime around because she literally fades from the historical record after 1550, so no one is quite sure what happened to her. Now, why is this? Well, to do that, we're going to need to take a look at what happened afterwards in the manner of sort of a movie. So, where are they now? Catherine was buried in the chapel of Sudeley Castle, and hers was the first royal Protestant funeral in English. Lady Jane Grey was the chief mourner to her, despite being like 11, which must have been really traumatic for her.
Probably sounded
Thomas Seymour in 1549 was executed for high treason after plotting incessantly against his brother and to marry the Lady Elizabeth without permission.
Gross. No, don't.
Edward VI.
Real Woody Allen figure.
Edward VI King Edward VI died at the age of 15 in 1553, but not before disinheriting both Mary and Elizabeth in favor of Lady Jane Grey, who was a good Protestant. Unfortunately, Lady Jane Grey would only reign for 9 glorious days before everyone deserted. No, before being deserted by everyone who went over to Mary, who they actually recognized as queen. Mary would start off strong at first, but when she decided she wanted to marry a Spanish dude named Philip, everyone, the English countryside broke out in revolt, and Mary had Lady Jane Grey executed at the age of 17. Mary married King Philip II of Spain, but she had no children with him, and so at the age of 42, when she died in 1558, the throne descended to her half-sister Elizabeth, who now was Queen Elizabeth I, who reigned for 45 glorious years, the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. She presided over a golden age of English culture and art, executed Mary, Queen of Scots, and fought off the Spanish Armada. Hers what has been known as the Golden Age, Elizabeth herself known as Gloriana. But really, in the end, it's interesting. The 6 wives of Henry VIII, Henry married them one after another to get an heir, and in the end, it was not the son who had a glorious reign, it was his daughter, by the infamous woman, Anne Boleyn. There's a moral here, but I can't figure out what the moral is.
The moral of the story is that girls rock.
Girl power, yeah! Actually, no, but genuinely, that is
and also about, his son, Edward. The moral of this story is don't be an uptight Protestant who killed him. Kill? Did he kill people?
He did execute both of his uncles, but they were also jerks, so, I don't blame him.
Don't be like an uptight 15-year-old. Otherwise, you might just die really
That's not
early.
his fault he got tuberculosis and all his hair fell out and he vomited blood.
That much of a nerd, he wouldn't have gotten tuberculosis. He's not cool. He just
Maybe he'd have been cooler had he lived longer.
I don't think he would have sanded out the edges.
Okay, so personality. Okay, so now time for a little wrap up. So, personality-wise, with regards to the 6 wives of Henry, they rank them. So, rank them, just based on who you like, from most to least. So, first one.
Anne.
Which Anne?
Oh, yeah. Boleyn. Then second is Parr. Parr. Then Aragon. Then Howard. Then, let me see. Cleves, and then Seymour.
Yeah, okay, so it's Anne Boleyn, Catherine Parr, Catherine of Aragon, Catherine Howard, Anne of Cleves, and Jane Seymour for you. I think for me it's Anne Boleyn, Catherine of Aragon, Catherine Parr, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Jane Seymour.
And Cleves is better than Howard?
I like Catherine, but those poor decisions she made are...
But, to me, that's kind of interesting. Howard is... not Howard. Cleves is just sort of, wacky side character that is there for, 7 weeks?
6 months.
6 months.
Most of which Henry was trying to get rid of her, so...
Yeah, to me, that's, you're just, the brief intermission where we get to have fun. She's like the comic relief episode.
So, in the end... What did we learn from the 6 wives? What is the moral of the story?
Having a lot of wives is really cool, and you should try it.
Maybe it's that Henry VIII... what I took away from this was that Henry VIII was a horrible, abusive jerk, and that he was not a good king.
I don't know if there's really a lesson here.
The lesson is that sometimes there is no lesson, and that's just how history is. So
the lesson is sometimes it's okay to have a daughter.
Yay! Girl power! So next time...
Women can do things too.
So next time on Enzo's Theater of the World, we will be focusing on... This is the final episode, by the way, because 2 weeks from now, I will be leaving for Oxford, so this will be an end to the first season. But don't worry, there will be a second season once I return from Oxford. So, or maybe at Oxford, who knows? Maybe my schedule will permit it. But anyway, the next episode... And the last episode for this season will be next week, and it will be on George Salmanazar, the very white, very French dude who managed to convince all of 1700s Britain that he was somehow Taiwanese. And you'll find out how next week on Enzo's Theater of the World. Goodbye!
Bye!